Should I start? That's the question. Okay. Okay, we are going to get started. Good morning, everyone. My name is Batsirai Majuru. I'm from the World Health Organization with the Water, Sanitation, Hygiene and Health Unit. And welcome to this session where we're going to be presenting a roadmap on regulating sanitation and small water supplies, and just an initial teaser on how to get started.
Come and look out for an email that's coming from Christian Zakino or Zoom events.
Okay. Is my clicker doesn't seem to be working?
There you go. Just if you lose it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's the screen that was a bit delayed. Okay.
If you lose it again, just tap on the screen here.
Yeah. Okay.
Bring the cursor over to it. And
Okay.
you'll be all set.
Sounds good. Thank you. All right. We just had a bit of a technical glitch, but I think we're ready to rock and roll. So we have three main objectives for this session today. The first is to seek your input on this roadmap on regulating sanitation and small water supplies. This is something that is in draft, and would really like to get your input on it. The second is to discuss emerging approaches to regulating sanitation and rural water supply systems, and how that links with our upcoming guidelines, these guidelines that we're updating for small water supplies. Some of you might be familiar with the WHO guidelines for drinking water quality, and we're now in the process of updating the same guidelines, but specific to small water supplies. And then thirdly, we want to just have a bit of a discussion on the role of regional regulators associations and what they can do and what they're currently doing to be strengthening the regulation of sanitation and small water supplies. So just to give you an overview of the scene today, I'm just going to start with a brief overview of where we're coming from, why we want to be discussing these topics. So just giving an overview of the guidelines that I mentioned, and also the guidelines on sanitation and health, which are basically the basis for why we want to be strengthening regulation of sanitation, and also talking a bit about our network of drinking water regulators that we work with. And then my colleague Sam Drabble is going to be presenting the roadmap. And then from there, we're going to have some case studies, some illustrative examples of some of the steps of that roadmap and how they're reflected in practice in some of the countries that are already taking steps to be regulating these services. So we will hear from participants from Nepal, from Palestine, and we were going to hear from Tanzania, but unfortunately it seems like they're unable to join. And after that, we'll have some Q&A, and we'll have a panel discussion. Okay, so why are we interested in strengthening regulation of sanitation services? I think the elephant in the room, and what's obvious to everyone, is that the management of sanitation services and equally regulation has always lagged behind that of water. And so in 2018, WHO developed comprehensive guidelines on sanitation and health. In the past, we did have some normative documents, but they were more specific to sanitation safety planning, wastewater reuse, etc. But we do not have any overarching guidelines that comprehensively bring together all the guidance that we want to share on how these services should be managed and should be regulated. And so now, as part of the rollout and implementation process of those guidelines, we are now working with regulators and with associations of regulators to support their uptake. And we're realizing that there are a lot of hiccups, if you like, when it comes to regulating sanitation. Overlapping mandates, unclear institutional roles, just a lot of things that would really need to be sorted out. And so this is the reason why we decided to work on this roadmap that would start to illustrate what steps could be taken when you're starting to be regulating these services. In parallel to this process, we are also in the process of updating our guidance on small water supplies. I just need to clarify what I mean by small water supplies. In some contexts, they could be referred to as rural water supplies, but really the scope of this guidance is covering everything that is not within the formal water supply service provision. So that could be tanker trucks, that could be rainwater harvesting, they could be springs, they could be boreholes, but anything that falls outside of that formalized piped supply network, we are terming as small water supplies. So the last guidance that we had on this, or the last guidelines that we had on this, were published in 1997, and that's the document on the left. And so between then and now, there's been a lot of change in this space around how these small water supplies are being managed and how they're being implemented. And this was the basis for needing to update this guidance. And so this guidance is not yet published. It will be coming out at the end of this year. But what we recognize is that even though we are developing this roadmap for regulating sanitation, there's some very obvious parallels between how you would start to regulate sanitation and how you could start to regulate small water supplies. And so in the context of this session, we just want to be able to, in a way, translate some of those steps in that roadmap for sanitation to small water supplies. And then finally, we have all this guidance that we develop as WHO, but we very much recognize that it's one thing to have theoretical guidance that is, in a book that's about this thick. If you've seen the WHO guidelines for drinking water quality, they're about 500 pages. And so at the end of the day, when we're trying to implement this guidance, what really matters is practical experience. What have others done to implement this guidance? And so to help translate those guidelines into practical, real-life experience, WHO hosts a network of drinking water and sanitation regulators. And this is really a safe space, a community of practice that brings together regulators from around the world to be discussing good practice in the regulation of drinking water and sanitation services in order to protect public health. And so as we're developing these guidelines, these regulators are really our target audience, our main target audience, and they're the people that we are working with in trying to seek feedback and as to how practical our guidance is, how implementable it is, if there's anything that is missing or if there's anything that needs to be included. And so you'll hear from some of them in the session today. So I hope that gives you a bit of background on why we are doing this work. I'm now going to hand over to Sam Drabble, who's been doing the work on developing this roadmap.
Thank you, Betsy, for the opportunity. Thanks to all of you for joining this session. So, as Betsy outlined, I'm just going to present some really emerging findings from the scoping phase of this study, Roadmap for Advancing Sanitation Regulation, briefly to build on Betsy's introduction in terms of the study aims and rationale. First thing to say is that there are sector documents that exist which present what we might call an end state for effective sanitation regulation, but there is a need for better step-by-step guidance, duly caveated, of course, so recognising the importance of contextual differences, but step-by-step guidance to support countries in identifying priority actions and charting the way forward. So the central question here for countries, particularly at a low base point in terms of sanitation regulation, what are the tangible steps they can take to begin to move forward? And I also want to acknowledge really the inspiration for this roadmap is the work of NOASCO, the regulator in Zambia, other regulators in the Eastern and Southern Africa region, the work of SOAST, Eastern and Southern Africa Water and Sanitation Regulators Association, which is doing fantastic work in promoting cross-country learning between these countries in this space. And NOASCO have documented what they've done in Zambia, and there's so much of use in that experience, and that provided the inspiration for a WHO blog, which then expanded, looked at the experience of other regulators, and set out an emerging roadmap to regulating sanitation services. And also want to underline this roadmap is being developed, of course, in close consultation with regulators, validated by regulators, and we want the roadmap to be taken up, and so it's critically important that those regulatory perspectives are essential to this. Briefly, before we present the current thinking on the roadmap structure, so it's set out as key milestones towards high-performing regulation, and short case studies are essential to this, and we're prioritising breadth of experience, because there's really a wide range of very inspiring regulatory initiatives that are now being driven forward in all areas of the roadmap. So we'll be featuring case studies from across geographies and across income groups, low-income countries, middle income, high income. And the key data collection source for this study are the regulators themselves. So we're conducting interviews with regulators from Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America. We're now partway through that, completed the scoping phase, and those interviews are ongoing. So this is to present just some very much emerging, the basic architecture for the roadmap that we've begun to develop based on those consultation with regulators. I'll move through it quite quickly initially, but I hope the rationale will come out as we move through the presentation. So first of all, and I hope people at the back can see this, stop me at any time if you can't quite read it, but I'll do my best to read it out. So step one, establish the current legal basis for service regulation. I think this is a really clear first step. Peter Matale, for example, at NOASCO is extremely clear on this point. If you're a country that doesn't currently have functional sanitation regulation, of course, the first step is to review where does legal responsibility lie, also contextual analysis to understand the sector, the system that authorities are working within. And that then informs step two, which is a review of both the institutional and the regulatory framework, and three aspects that we highlight there. Clarification of ministry roles, remembering that regulation is always a political process. Any regulatory authority is interacting with ministries. Clarification of regulatory responsibilities, of course, across service quality, economic, environmental, public health, and clarification of service provision mandates as well within that review process, because there are interdependencies between those ministry regulatory service provision mandates in terms of the extent to which effective regulation is possible. Building from that, you have the regulatory tools. So step three in the roadmap is really around the accountability mechanisms, the toolkit that any regulatory authority has at their disposal. And based on discussion with regulators, we currently have 6 brackets here. Of course, the setting of regulation guidelines, standards, codes of practice. Many economic regulators, of course, have a critical role in setting tariffs. Licensing, enforcement mechanisms need to be available. The role of the regulator in raising customer awareness, handling customer complaints, and performance benchmarking is emerging as a really powerful accountability mechanism that many regulators are already using across regions. The next step, and here I just want to pause to outline that this is not necessarily a linear process. We'll make that very clear. Step one is foundational, but once you move through the roadmap, actually there's more fluidity in terms of the sequencing of these steps, and of course many interdependencies. But step 4 is around building data management systems. So establishing clarity on key metrics, conducting sanitation service baselines, developing centralized data management systems, and we'll elaborate on that, data validation, of course, auditing spot checks, and publicly disclosing that data wherever possible connected to performance benchmarking. And then as we move through the roadmap, we move into the area of what we might consider more sophisticated regulation, perhaps higher capacity, perhaps more dependent on the presence of an autonomous regulator. And this might be the role of the regulator in going further, actually adopting a leadership role in the sector and building the capacity of service providers. So the brackets here include, of course, building the regulator's own human resource capacity, but then the role of regulators in training mandated service providers, recognizing that many regulators are only as good as the service providers they regulate, and indeed arguably the ministries they interact with. And then the role of regulators in creating new revenue streams, financing mechanisms. Because of course in most low-income countries there is a huge, in many cases, financing gap. And we've seen that regulators can play a role actually in driving forward innovative public finance mechanisms. And then finally emphasizing, of course, that this roadmap does not stop. There isn't a point where the situation is static. Even countries that might be viewed to have completed this roadmap in a sense are continuously reviewing, iterating, and having to adapt to emerging challenges. And the next slide I introduced with some trepidation, because I was in a workshop a couple of weeks ago where Henry Northover, who I respect a lot, was making the point that many presentations, he's tired of presentations highlighting high-level political commitment, but I think that does need to be emphasized here coming from the scoping phase. Many interviewees reference this point. this study, we need to set clear parameters around the roadmap. We need to recognise that regulation does not happen in isolation. It is a very politicised process. So clearly any country is not going to make significant progress against this roadmap without some level of political commitment and without financial resource allocation, whether that's external financing, domestic resource mobilisation, some combination of financial sources will be needed to provide the space to move this roadmap forward. This is to highlight the case studies that we're considering now. I mentioned that we're looking at breadth of experience for each of these steps in the roadmap. We've identified examples actually from low income, middle income, high income contexts and from across geographies. So to briefly talk you through these, when you look at step 2, reviewing and strengthening the institutional and regulatory framework, it's really striking that across regions there are many countries right now engaging with this process of clarifying responsibilities for regulation. So Mozambique, for example, the regulator hours recently introduced revised frameworks for regulating urban sanitation. We'll hear later on from the pool and the work that they're doing in this area. Peru expanding frameworks to rural areas. In terms of accountability mechanisms, many examples we could draw from here, but WaSREB, the regulator in Kenya, has done fantastic work introducing a pro-poor key performance indicator that requires utilities to report service coverage in low-income areas, slum areas effectively, informal settlements in cities. Manila in the Philippines is a great example of using tariff adjustments from the regulatory office to incentivize performance of the private sector. Japan is of note in enforcing standards, incentivizing product innovation. On data management systems, again, a number of examples you'll hear from today from Tanzania and Palestine, Swachh Bharat mission, of course, in India, developing national level information management systems. And on step 5, again, some really interesting examples. Botswana, they've invested in quite a high capacity unit to regulate sanitation. Many utilities across, regulators across Eastern and Southern Africa are engaging in strengthening utility capacity. We're in Rwanda, one such example. And there are also cases of regulators that are engaging with municipalities, even moving towards rural areas, to build the capacity of those municipalities to regulate small-scale on-site sanitation systems, although sometimes facing challenges there where it's considered actually too far beyond their legal purview. And finally, examples of countries that have, in some sense, completed this roadmap but are now iterating. Colombia, Malaysia, certainly. Azores, a really interesting case of regulating municipal-led service provision. And then the final example I wanted to give is just to show what this looks like at a country level. So we will, in the paper, be providing this a more in-depth case study of Portugal. There are any number of countries we could have included here, but Portugal is a really strong case. First thing to say here is that there has been broad stability of public policy since the 1990s in Portugal, even notwithstanding changes in government, but that foundation has remained. There's been effective long-term strategic planning. Moving through the roadmap, when you look at the institutional and regulatory framework, since ERSA, the economic regulator, was created in 1997, there have been progressive reforms. ERSA has a range of accountability mechanisms that it deploys very skillfully, advisory tariff proposals, arbitration of customer complaints. When you speak with ERSA, actually what they highlight is this concept of sunshine regulation. So this is traffic light grading of utility performance against key performance indicators, but with an emphasis on high performance and rewards. They have effective data management systems in place, including processes for internal and external audit of that operated data. They have a consolidated data platform for operators, so they're only making one request of operators. Those operators are not being pulled in multiple dimensions to provide the same data to different authorities. And really importantly, on-site sanitation, which is a key focus of this paper and this roadmap, that has recently been integrated into the ERSA benchmarking system. They're also providing training to utilities. They're very active on step 5 of the roadmap, excellent sessions to promote peer-to-peer learning. And they're now effectively on the 4th iteration of the regulatory model. So many of these steps were taken some time ago, but they continue to iterate. And right now they're considering how to regulate the circular economy. So looking ahead around challenges for climate resilience, recognizing the importance of addressing that issue, given water scarcity in Portugal, and how can they begin to regulate that effectively. Just to close, I wanted to share some examples of principles that will feature in the roadmap. And again, I emphasize this is purely illustrative, not at all the totality of what will be in the roadmap in terms of principles, but we wanted to share some examples. And I'm probably coming up to my time. So I think I'll focus first of all on step 2, review and strengthen the institutional and regulatory frameworks. I think there are two points here which it would be really useful to hear views on as we go through this session. One is around the necessity or not of autonomous regulatory entities, particularly in the area of economic and technical regulation. So there's emerging evidence. There was a recent SOAS study looking across Africa that showed autonomous regulation, or the presence of an autonomous regulator, is associated with a higher number of regulatory tools being deployed. You know, regulators will highlight this, of course, when you speak with them. We have a quote here: the first and most important advice is to establish a regulatory office. Many countries don't have this. I mean, it's very basic, but needs to be reflected upon. And secondly, integrated responsibilities. And I think this runs throughout this challenge. Ministries, for example, it helps the role of the regulator if responsibilities for water and sanitation are integrated within one ministry. So the regulator is not being pulled towards different ministries for water, sanitation, water resource management. It helps the regulator if responsibilities for service provision are integrated with, say, the utility, sewered and on-site. That's not always going to be possible, but again, it's worth reflecting upon. In terms of accountability mechanisms, I'll be very brief because I've touched on this, but just to emphasize one regulatory tool that still needs to be developed in many contexts, standards around fecal sludge treatment, and highlighting also the role of economic regulators, that they need sufficient autonomy to adjust tariffs to incentivize efficiency. On data management systems, I think the key principle that's emerging is around the need for this centralized system, as I mentioned, to facilitate internal coordination, but to minimize data requests on service providers. Also, the need to harmonize data and monitoring requirements at the global, regional and country level, something the JMP and SOAS are working together on currently. And to close by highlighting the potential for this leadership role of the regulator as you move towards more advanced regulation. So we have a quote here that I think really sums this up: to facilitate effective regulation, you need to capacitate the policymakers and the utilities, and high-performing regulators have that role to play as well in innovative public finance mechanisms. Just to close on next steps for this study and where we are. So, as I say, everything I've just presented is very much preliminary and emerging. We're continuing data collection through this year, and it's also worth noting there's a complementary study, and we're working with UNICEF and SOAS. They're working on a study on regulatory journeys, 6 countries in the Eastern and Southern Africa region. So ultimately, you'll see those two outputs that are presenting this and amplifying this roadmap approach. The next consultation, which is more in depth, is with regulators at the RegNet meeting and then the Water and Development Congress, both in Kigali in December. We'll have a peer review process, recognizing that it's critically important to validate this across multiple stakeholders, and hoping to publish at the end of March, first quarter next year. Okay. So that's certainly enough from me, probably gone over my time, but now we can hear from some of the institutions that are actually driving this work forward. Shall I?
Thank you, Sam. So there will be opportunity to present your questions to Sam, but for now we just wanted to go into this illustration of those steps of the roadmap. And to kick us off, I'm going to invite Jagannath Das, who is with the Ministry of Water Supply in Nepal. And he will be talking about creating a new regulatory authority in the country. And he works on the water side, obviously, so it'll be interesting to see how this is reflected on the other side. So Jagannath, over to you.
Okay. Thank you for Batsi. Starting from the Constitution of Nepal, in our Constitution, there are 2 fundamental rights related to safe water and sanitation. Best one, the fundamental right of safe water and sanitation. The key policies and regulatory document of water supply, sanitation and hygiene sector have been developed in Nepal in last 5 years. The first one is Water Supply and Sanitation Act. It is umbrella act of water sector in Nepal. And Nepal endorsed 2 major standards. The first one is National Drinking Water Quality Standard 2022, and it's implementing and monitoring Directive 2022. And the second one is Domestic Wastewater Effluent Standard 2023. The effluent standard for wastewater is from water treatment plant and safely disposed to the water bodies and land. There are 5 parameters in the standard, namely the pH, total suspended solid, BOD, COD, and equally. The maximum concentration limit of the equally is 1000 CFU per 100 ml. In Nepal, the only approved document regarding regulatory framework is sanitation. In sanitation is institutional and regulatory framework for fecal sludge management in urban area of Nepal 2017. It classifies role of government and to aid in the planning and regulation of urban area sanitation. Another important regulation document is Water Supply and Sanitation Regulation 2023, and this document is in the final draft phase and expecting to approve by the government by this year. In the document, the role and responsibility of the all three tier government, federal, provincial, and local is clearly defined, and provincial and locally sewered, non-sewered, and the on-site sanitation as a sanitation type, and ownership provision for the sanitation. And the provision of licensing is there, and also the provision of the tariff, and also and service provider should be registered according to the Water Supply and Sanitation Regulation final draft. In institutional and regulatory framework for fecal sludge management 2027, the objective of the framework is to facilitate and provide guidance for the effective planning, implementation, monitoring, and regulation of fecal sludge management. As we can see the institutional framework figure, and also there is a clear defined specific role and responsibility of key institutions. The main key point in the framework are the institutional arrangement and role and responsibility of the each institution, and the site selection criteria of fecal treatment plant is special because in Nepal there is a problem of land acquisition, and design and construction of on-site sanitation system is also important. And fecal and in sanitation chain from the fecal sludge collection, transport, and to the treatment and disposal and is in use also is important point in the framework. And we have the environmental monitoring and compliance monitoring and awareness raising and capacity building important part in the framework. The key reform in 22-23, the main key reform is we have now Umbrella Act of Water Supply and Sanitation Act 2022, which commits to protect the right to live in the clean and safe environment as a fundamental right of the Constitution. And we have now WAS Act and draft regulation, and also Joint Sector Review to 22-23. All document commits to establish a dedicated regulatory unit with qualified inspector under the Ministry of the Water Supply as a line minister, because till date we have no any defined regulatory unit. And provision of new water and sanitation inspector and surveillance agency is also the important, and the all three document have provision and emphasis for the water and sanitation inspector and surveillance agency. And service provider can charge tariff, but the charge will be should be the according to the comply on the standards. And penalty and compensation can be also imposed for the non-compliance and with the standard and determined by the authorized unit. Looking ahead, next step in creating the new unit, we should have established monitoring and regulation in our country, and establish the tariff fixation commission, and also there should be progressive tariff as per the service quality. And key challenges are we have the three tier government, so fragmented landscape for legal instrument and institution, and establish and roll out and consolidation of regulatory system and provision is also our key challenge, and regulatory capacity of the sector, institutional and provincial both is our challenges, and especially the fund is our challenges, mobilize fund in the sanitation sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Jagannath. I'm going to invite you, Jagannath, to just stay here in preparation for the Q&A session. I mentioned before that we were going to have a speaker from the Energy, Water and Utility Regulators Authority from Tanzania, who is unfortunately unable to join us today. So in his place, Sam is going to be presenting. So just to flag that Yeah, Sam is standing in.
Apologies for the
Ideally, would have
interruptions. We
had
have
the
the
regulator
actual
presenting,
speaker
but
available here.
Sam, I'm sure you do a great job.
Sakwa, do you copy?
So I apologise.
Apologies,
I
but we
know
do
what
have
a
the
disappointment
virtual
this would be
speaker.
to hear
We
from
can
me
acknowledge.
relative to the regulator in Tanzania. But let me do my best. And I haven't spoken with Fatayel, but he's provided this fantastic presentation. So let me speak to the work that Iwura is doing and how this fits into this roadmap concept, which I think it does very effectively. So I mentioned ERSA in Portugal as an example of a mature stage roadmap implementation. There are a number of countries in Eastern and Southern Africa that are at an earlier stage, but which are taking actions across the areas of activity represented in the roadmap. So you see here Fatayel's mapping of Iwura's activities against the roadmap. So under the step 2, review and strengthen the framework, there's a review of the National Water and Sanitation Policy in progress in Tanzania, also a review of the Water Supply and Sanitation Act of 2019, which is providing the basis for many of the regulatory changes that are taking place. Iwura has developed a wide range already of regulatory tools. You see here the tools approved by the Iwura board, so guidelines for on-site sanitation and FSM for water and sanitation authorities. I mentioned that's a gap in many countries, but this is something Iwura is addressing, as well as NOASCO in Zambia, other regulators in Eastern and Southern Africa. Guidelines for preparing a business plan for regulated water utilities and also for water and wastewater quality monitoring. In terms of licensing, Iwura again is looking actively at the licensing regime for water supply and sanitation authorities. Those have been amended to include a condition to acquire land for fecal sludge and wastewater treatment. In terms of public data management systems, again, this is something you see across regulators in the region. Many are now conducting these sanitation service baselines to understand what is the current level of service coverage across cities and rural areas. This is something that Iwura is now quite advanced in. They've collected that data. They've published some of the key data in the Water Utilities Report for 2020. They've also upgraded the Water Utilities Information System to include data on sanitation. And they've developed, or the Ministry of Water rather, is leading the development of a unified water information system. And then finally, on step 5, I think some really strong examples of Iwura's participation to build sector capacity. They're training water supply and sanitation authorities in on-site sanitation and FSM guidelines, and also engaging their own staff in peer exchange. Fatayel set out some lessons learned, and here this is where I do my best to share his perspective, but again, I haven't spoken with him. I hope we'll be able to have him speaking in more sessions around this roadmap. But for those lessons learned, Fatayel highlights, first of all, I think quite open that on-site sanitation and FSM is not effectively regulated still currently. There's some way to go. There's a lack of interconnectivity of provision of services and regulation across the service chain, but also overlapping responsibilities in service provision and regulation. So fecal sludge emptying and transport is provided still by multiple authorities, local government authorities, the water supply and sanitation authorities, private operators, and both Iwura and local government authorities have some role in regulation. So where those responsibilities begin and end at every step in the sanitation chain is still not always clear. But there is progress being made. The authorities in Iwura can assume service provision and regulatory roles for FSM under the Water Supply and Sanitation Act of 2019, and the guidelines for regulation of on-site sanitation and FSM are expected to address some of these challenges. And finally, for recommendations, so there is some really strong recommendations here, both in terms of service provision and regulation. So first of all, the need for an MOU to be signed between water supply and sanitation authorities, local government authorities, Iwura, looking at those responsibilities across the chain. I think point 2 here is really worth emphasising because it speaks to that higher capacity role of regulators in addressing the financing gap that exists in many low-income countries. So Iwura is now looking at devising a methodology to subsidise on-site sanitation and FSM, so a sanitation levy that involves an extra amount on the water bill for middle and high-income utility customers, and that revenue is then ring-fenced and can subsidise sanitation services for low-income households. This is something that WaSREB have also introduced in Kenya, Aura have introduced in Mozambique recently, and Iwura are also actively looking at this. The Ministry of Water also needs to review the sanitation regulations of 2019. And finally, water supply and sanitation authorities need to conduct citywide inclusive sanitation assessments looking at the sanitation options available along the service chain, and that will be reflected in Iwura's business planning guidelines. do we have Mohammed?
Yes.
Great.
Thankfully. Thank you, Sam, for doing a great job of standing in for Fatayel. Our next speaker, Our next speaker is Mohammed Al-Himaidi from the Water Sector Regulatory Council in Palestine. We just need to double check that he's able to hear us and that we're able to hear him, so bear with us.
All right. And Mohammed, if you could just say something really quick.
Yes, good afternoon. Or good morning. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Good morning.
All right. And I'll turn him up.
Doug, do you copy? Muhammad is speaking.
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay.
Good morning to you.
Good morning, Mohammed. We're glad you could join us today.
Thank you very much. It was tough to join you, but thank you all for giving me this chance. I can hear you well. If you hear me well, I'll proceed.
Yes, please.
All right. Good morning again. Well, I'm honored to be part of this workshop. In fact, what we have built over the past 9 years, it gives us the honor to say that we've accomplished something at the Water Regulatory Council in Palestine. You might know that in 2009, we have completed an assessment, institutional assessment, where we found that things are not going smoothly. The Water Authority was doing it all in terms of providing water management programs, whatever it is. So it was decided that a complete reform process is required, and that reform process has led to the establishment of the Water Sector Regulatory Council. It was approved by the cabinet, and it has the foundations for establishing the National Water Company and establishment of regional water utilities. So for the past 9 years, we've been there. We've been given a mandate by the law to monitor water and wastewater services. That, of course, includes production, transportation, distribution, consumption, wastewater management, and that includes technical performance monitoring, financial, institutional, as well as governance. The mandate we were given is crystal clear, and accordingly, we have started preparation of a number of bylaws that would support us. And the first bylaw we have established was issued the tariff bylaw, which was again approved by the Cabinet of Ministers. Then the establishment of regional water utilities and licensing bylaw that was again adopted by the Cabinet of Ministers. Now, to be able to monitor water and wastewater, including on-site sanitation, of course, we have to prepare our own modules, including tariff review, operation inspection, performance, governance, and then lately we have prepared the incentives and the complaint system to be online. Our council is in a way independent, which means that we only report to the Prime Minister. No one from outside the council have the right to tell us what to write and what not to write. No one has the right to tell us what policy recommendations we can make. Of course, we have a board of directors from different ministries and institutions and private sector, but again, that is upper supervision, but the technical team has the full capacity and the full right to prepare and submit the reports as well as the policy recommendations. It took me a while to train my team, and the first thing we've done, we've been to Kenya, to Portugal, to Italy, to Germany, to learn as much as we can, because we were the first in the region. In the Middle East, we were the first regulator to be established at this level, and that's why we had needed a year or two to prepare ourselves, but luckily we were able to report on the performance on the first year. Of course, regardless of being independent, we are financially monitored by the Ministry of Finance, by independent audit company, as well as by donors, whoever the donor is at any stage of financing the council. The council, being independent, is supposed to have two sources of funding. the donations from donors as well as licensing fees. But because the licensing fee took some time to be issued, we are only starting collecting the fees only next January. Next slide, please. And now, to be able to monitor the on-site sanitation as well as water and sanitation, we have prepared our database. It is information system, but that's an online database where all service providers, I'm here talking about almost 300 service providers in the West Bank and 25 in Gaza. And we collect 220 variables on water and 120 variables on sanitation. And out of those, we publish 21 indicators from each sector. 21 indicators on water as well as on wastewater, but all other data is available on our database. Of course, it took us some time to train and to bring the service providers to the level where we can trust their data. We have built, as I've said, trust between us and the service providers. We have prepared training manuals. We meet with them twice or three times annually to go through the KPIs and to discuss the indicators that we are looking. But of course, we give a good chance of time for them for peer-to-peer collection learning process. We publish 3 types of reports: an annual performance report, comparison report, where we show the service provider his situation over the illustrated indicators for that year and the 2 years before, and with the chance that he can compare himself to other service providers in the West Bank. And we are linked when the IPNet was working also to the IPNet. So service providers can compare their annual performance by themselves over the past years, over different indicators, as well as with other regulators around the world. On-site sanitation, of course, as I said, for water and wastewater, we monitor technical, financial, institutional, governance, gender, work efficiency. But on-site sanitation, we collect the type of on-site sanitation, disposal methods, the cost for disposal, and as I've said, the location for disposal. And now we are looking into the impact of such disposal. It was not in an authorized location. The collected data is used for performance evaluation, for policy recommendations, and for planning. We have tried to avoid pinning another NGO or another research institute. The aim is to improve efficiency, and that is, in a way, through policy recommendations to the government of Palestine as well as to the Water Authority, to support and to incentivize service providers. We have built, together with PWA, an incentives program. We have built an online complaint system, and our reporting is in the form of benchmarking reporting, where they can, as I've said, look into what they are doing. But still, because financial sustainability is a real issue, we have prepared training manuals on full cost recovery, operational inspection, and that the purpose of that operational inspection was to make sure that data collected is verified and they have the right way to collect, verify, and improve their data quality. Of course, the portal is open not only to service providers, but also to the developmental partners in Palestine. Of course, that has a number of challenges. As I've said, data availability, data accuracy is always an issue. There are some sort of emerging problems in Palestine as the current security escalations now, and our monitoring would look meaningless because there is no water systems anymore in Gaza. More than 55% was damaged by the current escalations. So sometimes regulators should not look or try to be a part of an assessment of emerging or emergency crisis. We look into our scale. The security-related crises are far beyond our capacities, but we look into data accuracy, data availability, and data accuracy and what sort of policy recommendations we can make out of these data. This is in short. I was given only a few minutes. And of course, anyone who is interested can have access to our database, and the not only 120 variables, but the other 220 variables in water can be reached. Our reports are all published. In short, the first thing we've done is to build trust between us and the service providers to make sure that we are not policing them. We are trying to guide them to make sure that they can meet the customers' expectations. Thank you very much for the chance. I'll be available during the session for any question. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. And yes, I'm sure there are a lot of questions for you from the audience. Just before we go into that Q&A session, I just want to highlight that we have set up a Mentimeter platform where you can go and give your input to the roadmap that Sam just presented. So we would love to hear from you. What is missing? What do you think is not necessary? How can it be improved? So throughout this discussion and throughout the rest of the day, you would be able to access that platform. The link is available on the screen right now, and we've also shared it on that flip chart over there. So for now, I'm going to invite Sam to come back up to the front so that we can go into a Q&A session. And of course, Mohammed, please stay on the line. So I don't know if there are any questions for Sam on the roadmap, for Jagannath, on what he presented on the legal and institutional reform in Nepal, or any questions for Mohammed. Yes. If you please just walk up to the mic to make sure that Mohammed is able to hear you.
Hi, thanks for that. Really interesting. I'm Heather Skilling from the AI. I had a question about enforcement, because I think that often sort of slides below the radar and we don't spend enough time thinking about it. And I'm wondering in the case studies if you could flesh out in one of the ones on the more mature level how enforcement has actually taken place, what kind of powers there are for enforcement, what kind of capacities are necessary for enforcement, what's sort of the outcome of those enforcements. Any of that, I think, would really be welcome. I think then we could plan at the front end to make sure that the enforcement mechanisms are in place.
Thank you for that. We'll take a couple more questions.
Patsy, I can't hear any of the questions that was, if it was at me. If it was to me, please repeat it, please. Patsy.
Okay, I think the question might have been mainly for Sam, but you're also welcome to provide input as well. The question was on enforcement. So her feedback was it'll be good to see on the roadmap more on enforcement. How is it being done? How is it working? Etc. But I think we will invite a few more questions, and when you're posing your questions, please just let us know who the question is directed to so that Mohammed also knows whether he needs to respond directly.
If nobody lines up, I'll take a turn. Jan Willem Rosenboom, I'm an independent consultant. I missed the first couple of minutes, so you may have mentioned this, but I was wondering whether you could speak to the role of RegNet in kind of supporting countries in developing and implementing the roadmap and providing best practices and things like that, how that ties together. Thanks.
Thank you for that. Yes, please.
Hi, thank you. Andy Narracott with UNICEF. I'm interested from those who gave the case study, maybe not Sam, that how do you think, looking back and looking at this roadmap that was absent in your journey of developing an autonomous regulator, how useful would this have been and how would you have used it? Because I think it's really interesting from us in this room and from an intellectual perspective to look at this journey of a roadmap and developing a regulator. but I'm looking interested in the practicality of like how can it be used? How can we make it more useful to those many other countries that are looking to develop autonomous regulation as well? Thank you.
Thanks for that.
Thank you. Myself, Dr. Service from Nepal. I want to ask some question to Sam, because the roadmap is going on in Nepal, but how the sanitation roadmap is correlated with health, because this is a water and health conference. So the roadmap which is developing in countries, different countries, how it will correlate for the health also. So my question is that for Sam. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take one more question. The gentleman in the glasses, I'm sorry, he's been waiting for a while. We'll have another round of questions.
Thank you very much. In the presentation, I realized that in determining the institution that will be responsible for managing and also what we call the autonomous regulatory institution is situated in 4 areas. There's one which is more situated in the ministry and closer to the ministry. There's a second one which is related to the municipality, and then one which is also just an institution and a bit towards independence. I'm asking myself, in developing the guidelines, couldn't we have received an indication as to which one it would be better in which environment? That's my question. The second one has to do with the indication of the process. There are a lot of description of the process. But how, in the samples, how is that related to the output of providing efficient and effective service?
Thank you for those. Maybe I'll invite Sam and Jagannath to respond to some of the questions, and I think there was also a question for Mohammed.
Shall I go first?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So let me take the question on enforcement first, and we'll see how, if we want to then bring in some of the other panelists and come back. But I think that's a fantastic question, Heather, and it's really one of the more challenging aspects that we still need to unpack. So I think that the short answer you asked around case studies, I think it's emerged more as a challenge to be resolved rather than examples of best practice. So I think when you look at on-site sanitation, fundamental challenge is that local government capacity to monitor household level on-site sanitation systems, for example. I think that the Zambia model is interesting, where that responsibility is still with local government, and then you have the connection with the regulator and the utility. So I think that example is potentially worth looking at, but I think it's a huge issue, that human resource capacity of the regulator and the local government to enforce effectively. I think what has come out from the interviews, I mean, obviously there are different elements around enforcement on economic regulation. It's more feasible. The enforcement mechanisms can be there. Gave the example in the presentation of Manila, which I think is a really clear example, where they've actually recently introduced the capability to fine the service providers that they're regulating, and you need to have clearly those positive incentives as well as the punitive aspect or the capability to do that. So I think on the economic side there are examples out there, but in terms of actually service quality and particularly household level sanitation systems, that's a challenge that we will be looking further into, but I thank you for highlighting it. Should we go to...
I think, so maybe for now I'll turn it over to Mohammed on this question on how useful would this roadmap have been when you were setting up the Water Sector Regulatory Council in Palestine. I think there was a question that came from Andy. And Jagannath, maybe if you can reflect on the same question, how useful would this roadmap have been when you were starting this review of the regulatory mandates in Nepal? So while you're thinking about that question, the other one that I want to come back to, Sam, is on which regulatory system would be better. I think the last question was, you have the regulation by ministry, you have regulation by municipality. In developing the guidelines, would it have been better to indicate already which regulatory system would have been better? I'm also interested in that question, and I'm happy to chip in, but maybe I'll give the first opportunity to use that.
Shall I go first?
Yes, go ahead.
Great. Yeah, thank you for the question. I think, again, that's a really fundamental question that we were looking forward to, I think, getting some perspectives on, actually. I mean, let me offer you a personal vantage point on this, and it's only my vantage point in the sector, but we've worked closely with autonomous regulators in Kenya, in Zambia, in Mozambique, and we've seen how central those regulators have been to driving sector reform, because every sector needs leadership, and that's the point that I would start at. You know, there needs to be that leadership capacity within the sector, whether that's coming from the ministry or in some cases it may come from an autonomous regulator. So I think that's one argument in favour of the presence of an autonomous regulator. Of course, we need to be nuanced and recognise that every country is starting from a different position. It's not always going to be possible to make that type of institutional reform, but I think it is instructive that this is a shift in the sector, and we're seeing it not only in Eastern and Southern Africa. We're seeing it, as was presented, in Nepal, Bangladesh, India. We're seeing it in West Africa. There is an increasing emphasis on developing that autonomous regulation where it doesn't currently exist. In terms of the roadmap and how we address that, I think that's still something that we're thinking through. The roadmap, of course, needs to acknowledge the different regulatory models that exist, and it needs to be nuanced in the analysis. But I think we do also need to acknowledge the emerging evidence around autonomous regulation. And just to highlight that we'd love to get your view on that question as well. So go to menti.com, you can give a response there.
That was a question that we had for you as the audience, so it's interesting that you turned it on us. But maybe just to complement what Sam said, I think exactly there is some emerging evidence, particularly from the landscape study that ESO was commissioned 2 years ago, that suggested that independent regulatory authorities actually seem to be more effective. But we recognize that in terms of how these regulatory systems develop, they develop over time. There are very few countries that wake up and establish an independent regulatory authority. Often it's coming from a ministry and then it branches out into something that is more independent. And so I think recognizing that incremental process is important. Certainly our view is that having some oversight is better than none. Don't let perfection be the enemy of the good. So if there's already some oversight that's happening within a ministry, it's better than having no oversight at all. I want to come back to Mohammed. The question was, how useful would this roadmap have been when you were starting off on your regulatory journey? You mentioned that WSRC was set up 9 years ago. Do you think that if you had had this roadmap then, you would have been better off?
Well, look, from day one, we have put a number of scenarios. Should we be part of the water authority, of a ministry, of the cabinet? And the conclusion was that because we are supposed to improve efficiency and to prepare policy recommendations, we have to be independent. Otherwise, as if we are looking into our own policies, and that does not have any transparency, we cannot be there monitoring ourselves. So we thought of being independent. That would give us strength that we can recommend from a technical point of view that we believe this is right or this is wrong. We've seen some examples in the Arab world, in Jordan, in Oman, in Abu Dhabi, where they have regulators linked to ministries. They are tied, and as if they reflect their own government viewpoint. And it's not a true reflection of the current situation on the ground. And that's why I would be always recommending to have independent regulatory tools, although that might be tough in terms of budgeting, because once you are independent, you may not have budget line at the Ministry of Finance. But we have overcome that through the donor support as well as the licensing fees. Now, in terms of the question from the friend from UNICEF, how useful that was, look, because we have felt that UNICEF is working in most of the times in fragile communities, and they cannot wait for a year to look into the performance report. We are now collecting quarterly data for UNICEF, the key indicators, and the intention is to start updating UNICEF on monthly basis, because they cannot and they should not wait for a year for the performance report. So in that terms, well, I wish we can update our data continuously. But still, we cannot do that. Now we can do that quarterly, some key indicators, and annually for the general indicators. And that's where UNICEF can make use of our data, at least on quarterly basis.
Thank you for that, Mohammed. I think we're running out of time, but I do want to give opportunity to Jagannath to also reflect on that same question. If you could keep your input brief. Thank you.
Thank you, Baxi. In our context, regulatory roadmap is also necessary.
I think you need to bring the mic closer, I'm not sure.
In our context, regulatory roadmap is also important and necessary for plan and implement and monitoring and evaluation of WAS work. It supports governance system of water supply, sanitation and hygiene in Nepal also. The implementation of regulatory roadmap is most and interesting in our three-type government system, and we are new in this regulatory work, so it will be interesting and also challenging in our context.
I think the people at the back want you to speak into the mic more closely. Yeah. Yeah, a bit closer, exactly. Yeah.
In our context, a regulatory roadmap is necessary for plan implementation and the monitoring evaluation of WAS-related activities. It supports our governance system of water supply, sanitation and hygiene. The implementation of regulatory roadmap is most and interesting in our context of the three-tier government, and it will be beneficial to our WAS system. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Jagannath. I wanted to come back to the question that was asked about how this roadmap would be addressing health aspects. And I think when we started the session, I was saying that the sanitation guidelines on health were actually the basis for developing this roadmap, because as WHO, of course, our mandate is public health, and what we're really trying to do is to ensure that public health is being comprehensively and appropriately considered in sanitation regulations. So in developing this roadmap, of course, we recognize that regulation is not just about health. There are also other aspects, the economic aspects, the consumer protection aspects, but in developing this roadmap, it's our contribution to ensure that health is also inserted and is mainstreamed as part of broader regulation. Jan Willem's question was a good one on the role of RegNet in this process. So as we're developing this roadmap, we're getting input from RegNet members and also other regulators who are not within RegNet, recognizing that a lot of them, there are some who are already regulating sanitation. There's a lot to be learned from them. So for instance, that's why we had the presentation from Tanzania and the other countries that are within RegNet that have already been doing this work on regulating sanitation services. Now, beyond that, this is where we would really want to be harnessing that peer-to-peer support the countries can provide within RegNet. So if the countries that are now emerging in that process, they're now starting off to regulate, who do we pair them up with? Can they consult with URSA, the regulator in Portugal? Can they consult with NUASCO, who've already made some inways? But also related to that, and also with the support of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we've been doing a lot more work in working with the regional regulators associations, because we recognize that as we're trying to improve uptake of these guidelines and also uptake of this roadmap once it's published, these regional associations are a key entry point because they can reach a wide number of countries. They have a lot of lessons that have been learned from the countries that are within the associations. And between regional associations, between the regional association in Africa and the regional association in Latin America, there are also a lot of lessons that are being learned. We're going to hear actually now in a few minutes on the work that's being done to set up a regional regulators association in South Asia and how we can be working better with them. So just to flag that in our own thinking around this, I think it's a practical experience that the regulators who have already embarked on sanitation can bring to the others who are starting off. So with that, I want to end the session and thank everyone. We're going to go into a panel discussion. Sophie will introduce it to you. But just a quick reminder, we still have the Mentimeter up. We're still happy to get your feedback, your criticism, your suggestion, anything that you can provide to make this roadmap better. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Betsy. So the next session will be a panel discussion, and again, we'll open up the discussion again to everyone else. So this is a discussion, and we hope that this will carry on. But so Jagannath, you're a bit lonely here, so I will invite other speakers to join us. I'd like to invite Sudan Pandit from the WHO office in Nepal to join us here. I would like to invite Kasenga Hara from NWASCO to join the panel as well. I'd like to invite my colleague Batsy to join us. And I also would like to invite Mr. Harry Standard from WaterLinks. Is Harry? Yeah. And of course, we'll have Mohammed, who will stay with us online for the panel discussions. So maybe I had an order of questions, but I'm offering to switch it because these questions on the role of Regulators Association just came up, and I thought it would be interesting to ask the first questions to Harry. What is the role of Regulators Association in strengthening regulation of water supply and sanitation? So maybe let's start with you first. You have 2 to 3 minutes.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. My name is Ari, and maybe like Sam, I'm actually sitting in for WaterLinks. I'm a member of WaterLinks. So, yeah, thanks, Sophie. So, WaterLinks actually has worked to convene certain countries, I think, in early September on how to think about this South Asia Water and Sanitation Regulatory Association. I think from my notes here, I'm reporting out on that event. There were six countries, actually: Bhutan, Indonesia, the state of Odisha, which is a part of India, Nepal, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, who attended that. And I think there was some consensus to move forward, but start incrementally, I think, from informal discussions. You mentioned community of practice earlier, so perhaps it's that level of at least agreement to kind of think about what it looks like to shape an association at the region. And part of that process is actually linking with the East Asia and Eastern and Southern Africa Association, as you mentioned before, is to learn from how they did it. And I think maybe an extension to that, you mentioned Latin America, which could also be another peer, right, to kind of learn and go through that process. Also from the report out, there's also more priority, I think, on having these countries that attend set up different mechanisms or different structures of regulatory framework. I think we heard from Nepal. And just to learn from that aspect, and also from maybe countries within South Asia and Southeast Asia, the ASEAN, for example. There's Malaysia, you mentioned it, and then at subnational level in Manila, of course, there's a regulator that deals with both of the concessions in Manila itself. So having those practices from different levels of frameworks would be useful for the association to set up. So more like a case study at this point. Let's see, I'm trying to read my notes here as well. But WaterLinks itself has done other work outside of these countries that I mentioned. In Bangladesh, I think they're looking at the subnational level, working with the Dhaka Water and Sewage Authority to have some sort of a agreement, a regulatory framework with a subsection of Dhaka city itself. I think Dhaka is quite large. So that kind of subnational case studies would be useful to kind of understand. I think there's discussion on having it a national level regulatory, or is it subnational, or is it independent or within the ministry? So these are some of the in-process learning, I think, on the roadmap, which is on the A1 and A2 side of things at the moment.
Thank you. Very interesting perspective from the regional side, and we'll get a chance to come back to that. Maybe I will turn to Sudan, and I will ask you, what do you view to be the key prior enablers for successful implementation of a roadmap?
Thank you, Sophie, for the question. And as we, WHO country office, support to member state, in our perspective, we believe that key enabler, talking about the enabler, that is the main, what is the vision of the roadmap. That is very important. because sanitation itself, the definition is very vague. The boundary of the sanitation is quite large. Even if we are talking about this roadmap, either it should include a small water supply or not, that was a major questions. Within the sanitation also, solid waste management in many countries, that also the part of the sanitation. But if we are talking about the JMP definition, certainly that solid waste management is not within that definition. That is the first question. And second enabler should be the clear objective, talking basically from Nepal, that is the establishment of independent, dedicated regulatory authority. And that is functional, that is well capacitated, that is the objective. To make that authority, certainly we need some enablers, some basic enabling environment that include political commitment, number one, and effective leadership could be the within that. That is the number one requirement for to implement the roadmap. Second could be the engagement of the wider stakeholders, including health sector and other urban development sector. There are so many ministries, not only ministry related to water supply. That is the second important enabler. And third could be the resource management. Even we start to talking about the establishment of the authority, manpower and capacitated manpower, licensing, all these are the enabling factors that could help. And the almost another important issue could be the system of the monitoring and evaluation. If we are talking about the monitoring and evaluation to see the compliance, certainly there should be so many kind of the standard, national standards, not only effluent standard, just my colleague, he mentioned, standard of the fecal sludge, not only, that is the so many steps in the sanitation. Every steps may need a different kind of the standards. For example, Ministry of Environment, they are producing standards for the industry, they are producing wastewater from the hospital, like that. These are and other dedicated indicators are the quantitative indicators, tariff fixation, licensing, penalty, and these are, and finally data management. Obviously we hear from Palestine that regulatory management information system, but in case of Nepal, there is MIS system that we call UNWAS, but risk analysis management system or communication as a whole, these are the enablers. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sudan. I understand that, of course, the vision is really important, but also you need to have political leadership, and that's really key when embarking on this journey and mapping what needs to be done to strengthen the regulations. You mentioned the resources, very important as well, and the engagement of all the different sectors. And we know that in sanitation it's very fragmented across the chain, so having everyone on board is also crucial to ensure the success of the implementation. Maybe staying in Nepal, I will ask a question to Jagannath. In your experience, what have been the key drivers of this high-level government engagement in strengthening regulation? So building on what Sudan mentioned.
Thank you, Sophie. In strengthening regulation, in our context, there should be clear role and responsibility of all different level government and regulatory authority accordingly, and also the extent and severity of the public health risk and epidemic situation or disease outbreak may play the vital role for strengthening the regulation need, and also the availability of financial resources, support and engagement of the development partner, investment on the infrastructure of waste service play the vital role for the high-level governmental engagement in strengthening the regulation. And climate, to the hot topic, climate change impact of climate change on water resources and sanitation infrastructure is also maybe the key driver, and public awareness on sanitation issue maybe on the one driver, and regulating gap or weaknesses in existing sanitation regulation maybe the one point for the strengthening regulation, and capacity of the institution and effective leadership maybe the other driver for the strengthening the regulation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jana. Interesting to see how also disease outbreaks, I hear climate change impact on water and sanitation infrastructure and also public awareness on sanitation issues are also kind of contributing to raising the issue and highlighting the need to do something about it. Maybe I'll turn now to Batsy, to Kasenga. I'd like to ask you the same question in Zambia. So, in your experience, what have been the key drivers again of high-level government engagement?
Thank you very much, Sophie, for the question. But first of all, before I answer it, I would like to go back a little bit background to what triggered all this movement towards similar work that has been highlighted here, the roadmap. So the idea of regulating sanitation, in particular non-water sanitation, and then the small water schemes was spread around about 2016, not only in Zambia, but also in the region, the SOS region, Eastern Southern Africa region. This followed realization, obviously, that we had made a lot of progress on the waterfront, at least in the urban and peri-urban areas, but we're lagging behind in the rural areas and the non-sewage space front in particular. So we did what was called a gap analysis for the region, basically looking at what we'd like to break down in the SOS region. 3 blocks: the regulatory governance, so we're talking about the policy, environment, the institutions, plus the legal environment itself. And then we look at the substance, regulatory substance, the mechanisms referred to earlier, and then the impact of that regulation. And we discovered that we were all at different levels in the region. There were countries that, like Rwanda, for instance, because of their nature, quite small, they had already moved into the non-sewage sanitation space, also the rural side. A country like Lesotho didn't even have like proper legal mandate for the regulator and the utility on the sanitation front, and kind of different. Following that, in Zambia, we developed what we call the regulatory frameworks, both for the non-sewage space and the rural. I'm trying to answer this particular question. But what was important and what's very important in terms of the drivers, we believe firmly the regulatory governance space needs to be sanitized. So there has to be proper policy direction that provides the enabling environment for the institutions, for the legal environment as well, so that we have clarity of roles of all the different players. Sanitation in particular, like so many other countries, has many institution homes. So that was the case as well for our case. But we had to go through a process of consensus building, identifying the critical institutions, the critical ministries, and we're lucky, eventually the government then put up a ministry responsible for water and sanitation, distinctively dedicated to that sort of mandate instead of fragmenting it like the case were before. So this is the lead ministry for all the interventions. Now, we looked at the legal review and we found that we didn't have to change much in our case compared to other countries. So all we did was basically an extension of mandate from the utilities. Now, you need to understand also the background. The utilities, commercial utilities as we call them, are basically joint ventures of the local authorities who are by law are mandated to provide a service. So we did an extension of mandate because most of these are actually formed on a provincial basis, regional basis. So they look into the non-sewage space and also on the rural side to take care of the small water supply schemes, both in the urban and rural. It's quite easy for the urban and peri-urban because we have fully fledged regulation, a little bit of a build-up process in the rural areas as we put in place the instruments for regulation. So, but the key driver was the fact that from the political angle, the governments realized the fact that we needed to meet our long-term vision, Vision 2030, 100% water coverage, at least 90% sanitation coverage. This is similar to other countries like Angola in our region as well. they may have Vision 2035 singing basically to this universal coverage in the country sense. So the political will was there, the regulatory environment, because of the experience we've had on the water side, was there, so it's basically extension of all these particular tools. Now, I will invite, from the questions asked during the Q&A, I will invite all the delegates here to look at the SOS website, because we have developed tools, package this into what we call a regulation handbook. So please go to www.sos.org, look at the regulation handbook. It will give you experience on some of the questions asked, setting up a regulator. But we also recently did a landscape study that looks at the regulatory reform, the regulation by agents, regulation by ministry or department and so on. We didn't want to give recommendation on what's best, because we know governance systems differ from one country to the other. I'm inclined to saying autonomous regulation, because that's the background and that's where I'm coming from. But this will give you proper insights on how to go about these processes. So the rest of the stuff is, we're in the process, we've developed quite a number of tools. The tariffing has been segregated, so it's no longer bunched up water and sewerage. We've got dedicated tariff for sanitation in particular. We're looking at mechanisms now to subsidize the rural areas, but we're also pushing this front with the government to set up a fund, at least for the medium to the long term, that will assist with subsidizing the rural water and sanitation front, because the utilities, in any case, in the urban setup, may not be, all of them, financially viable to venture into the rural space. So we project that subsidies have to be embedded in the process, including cross-subsidization in the tariffing process. I think I will end here as a response for now.
Thanks, Kasenga. And you mentioned the regulatory forms, autonomous regulators, and it's a nice segue to my next questions. And I will ask Mohamed if he's still online with us. Mohamed, do you think the role of autonomous regulators should be put forward more strongly in the roadmap? Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you well. Let me first just say a statement that over the past 2 months, I've been preparing a concept note to establish Arab countries' water regulatory association. And I've presented that to 14 Arab countries who have shown interest, and I believe we are going there. And we will have soon, hopefully, the Arab water regulatory tools. On the question, yes, look, a regulator is not another NGO. It is not another research institute. It is established for a purpose, which is not carried out by anyone else. Therefore, a regulator looks into the customer's interest and expectations and their voices. It looks into the level of adherence to governmental policies and strategies. It looks into the donors and taxpayers, if their money was very well used or not, or if it was monitored or not. It looks into the private sector investments in the water and sanitation sector. So to gain the respect of all of these different stakeholders, the roadmap must look into the seriousness and level of policy recommendations they are preparing. At the same time, from time to time, the roadmap should have a space where regulators' impact is being looked into. Was that useful? What was the impact of that regulator on the sector? What was the impact of that regulator on the government policies, on the private sector, on donors, on the customer's voice? So I would think that that point is to be added somehow, somewhere to the roadmap, that it's not data collection, it's not performance monitoring, but to look into the impact of the whole purpose and existence of the regulator. Thank you.
Thanks, thanks, Mohamed. No, so we have 5 minutes left. So what I'd like to do in those next 5 minutes is hear from you. If you have any comments or reaction, or if you have further questions for our panelists, you can come to the mic. So any questions, any reactions to what you've heard? Silence. Perhaps, Ari, you would like to make some further comments?
Just reflecting to this again, because in terms of regional regulator or association, because in the early 2000s in Southeast Asia and South Asia, there was an effort, and it was established, the Southeast Asia Water Utilities Network, for example, and then the South Asia Water Utilities Network. Now, they're kind of defunct, you can say. So these are lessons to be learned, right? What is it? Who will hold the chair? I know it's a moving secretariat. I believe for the South Asia one, Nepal has offered to hold that secretariat, at least in the early stages. But the ownership and then just getting different countries in the region, I think it makes sense contextually. But you mentioned political will, and then all these factors. So who takes the lead? Associations obviously are quite strong in different countries, Southeast Asia and South Asia. And again, utility is a maybe anomaly because it's not all the service providers are utilities. There are sometimes city departments or municipalities and so forth. So these are some of the, I think, constraints or not constraints, but the things to consider as you move into something in the region.
Thanks.
Can I just supplement on that?
Yeah, Kasinga.
Yep. Thanks again for the opportunity. So the SOS Regulators Association was formed right about 2000. We began very small, Zambia, Kenya, Mozambique coming together. There was this huge movement in the region to form regulators, Zambia taking the lead for autonomous regulation. But then we realized we needed to kind of learn from each other, promote effective regulation generally, and harmonize approaches. And I believe this is very important also, not only for regulation of water sanitation, but also for regional integration. So we had a series of meetings, consensus building, and eventually agreed we needed an association legally registered. So it's registered in Zambia. We governed by an MOU, of course, governed also by the laws of Zambia, and we have operational laws. So it's all about consensus. It takes a while, and we've grown from the initial 4 countries to 10 countries in the region, and we're getting more and more. In fact, more demand to stretch Africa-wide. This is what now we're really looking at. Should we go really continent-wide? We've got diverse cultures, diverse also governance mechanisms, Franco, British, and so on. But it's all about this will to come together, learn from each other, be able to do peer-to-peer learning, be able to be peer-reviewed. So we go into a particular country and speak to the relevant stakeholders, including the governments, and advise on the sort of regulatory reform that they probably need to put in place. It's worked very well for us. I welcome anybody to come and learn from the SOS family on this journey. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, the importance of peer-to-peer exchanges and learning from others, and really impressive, like how how it's grown, like over the years, and yeah, it's really interesting case. I'm conscious of the time, so I think we're going to close. But I'll ask maybe Betsy, do you want us to share a few final reflection before we close the session?
Yeah, sure. I think there were a few things that were mentioned that were really interesting to me. So some of the drivers for establishing establishing a regulatory authority in Nepal, and thinking about climate change and its impact on sanitation infrastructure. I thought that was really interesting. I also found it really interesting, this discussion on establishing regulators associations, and I would be very happy to follow up with you, Mohammed, on this, because that's something that we've been thinking about for the Arab region. And maybe if time was permitting, it would have been great to hear your insights on what would be the driver for that, because I think, to Ari's point, it's easy to set up something. The real question is how you maintain it. And I don't doubt that there's that will amongst the Arab countries, but I think it would be also interesting to learn from other associations that are in existence. What are they doing to keep themselves going, and maybe to keep themselves financially viable, and how are they working with other partners in the region? But from my side, maybe I also wanted to highlight just a few next steps in this process. Sam already mentioned that this roadmap is in draft form. Again, if you have input, we'll be very much open to hear it. We also want to be presenting it at the IWA Development Congress that will be held in December in Kigali, so we'll have a side event there. But more importantly, we're also going to be presenting it at our meeting of the International Network of Drinking Water and Sanitation Regulators, REGNET, that WHO coordinates. We're already getting input from some of the REGNET members, including Mohammed, including Fatayel, who couldn't be here today, and others. But the idea is to present it to a wider audience then. So we are very much looking forward to input from a wide range of stakeholders on this roadmap. But then the key after that would be how we implement it, because it's not a WHO roadmap. It's a roadmap that we are developing for the sector. It's just that we've happened to take leadership on it. So if there are partners who are working in this regulatory space, if there are things that resonate with you, I would also love for you to take it up and to share it in your own work. So with that, I would say thank you very much for coming to this session. And again, please provide your feedback.
And thank you again to all our panelists and speakers, and of course, the audience for joining. Thanks.
Mohammed, a very big thank you to you. We appreciate you joining the session.
Thank you very much, Betsy. Thank you all. Thank you for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Secretary, we have thought about rotation, but I think for stability purposes, it is better because the set of processes.
Do we just stop the webinar?
You know, and it's a member based. So it's member based. So actual budget of they do contribute, but also the staff. So we